Hello and welcome. I'm Mariam, co-founder and CEO of Babbly. Today I'm bringing you another episode of interviews where I speak to experts from the world of child development and ask them questions that I struggle to find straightforward answers to as a first-time parent. Hi, Talia.
Hi, Miriam.
You.
Yeah, it's great to see you.
So just background-wise, we're so fortunate to have you as an advisor at Babbly. And over the past couple of weeks, we've been talking a lot about, getting the word out there, raising awareness, both in terms of importance of parent coaching, which is something that you do all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I've watched it firsthand by, joining so many calls. But before we dive into that, I would love for you to maybe formally introduce yourself, give us some background about your educational background and your clinical practice, and we'll start from there.
Sure. Yeah, I'm very excited to be here. So like you said, I am a speech pathologist. I was trained actually in the States. I went to school in New York at Columbia University and completed my clinical master's there. And prior to that, I had done a research-based master's in health sciences at the University of Western Ontario, where I kind of had an opportunity to pursue more the research side of speech pathology. But what I learned from that and why I pursued the clinical program after was that my favorite part of the field was working with people, working with the families. And then I've been in Toronto since I graduated, and I work at the George Hall Center through Early Abilities, which is the government-funded program for speech and language services for young children in Toronto. And I have a private practice called Acorn Speech Pathology as well.
Sorry, I was on mute. Was just saying, let's go back a little bit. What got you interested in speech and language?
Sure. So in my undergrad was at McGill University, and I studied psychology, for lack of a better idea of what I wanted to do. And I kept gravitating towards courses that were related to language and language learning and the sociolinguistics, and I did a minor in linguistics as well. And around that time, I spoke to a guidance counselor. I didn't really know what I was going to be doing. And he said, your coursework really lends itself quite well to speech pathology. Why don't you consider that? And it was right around that time that a friend of mine actually had a traumatic brain injury, which he has made a miraculous recovery from. But he shared a lot of his experiences working with a speech pathologist and how the speech pathologist helped him really in his recovery process. So it was sort of those two things coming across my way around the same time that really led me to think that that was the path for me.
That's great. How would you explain what speech pathology is to someone who doesn't exactly has heard about it for the first time?
So I'd say speech pathology, it can be quite a broad field because we can work with adults. We can really work across the lifespan. So from really, really, really young infants up through adults. And that we sort of are experts of like this part of the body. So we'll do a lot of work around speech, so articulation, how the words sound, how fluent or smooth or clear that language is. Language, so vocabulary or grammar, swallowing, because that's sort of the same mechanisms. And then a whole other sort of less concrete concepts that go into communication, like the social use of language and pragmatics or memory and cognition, and all of those more subtle elements that people really need to have in order to communicate. So we can work on elements of all those aspects of communication. And when a big part of our job is when oral speech is impossible, we'll work on alternative forms of communication, whatever that may be for each individual person.
Really cool. I guess I got a glimpse of that with picture boards and teaching sign language to children and infants. But it's really interesting, as you pointed out. I thought that's very true. You guys don't just talk about, work with oral muscles and motors, but there is a whole world of communication outside of speech that you guys have to be trained on and touch on. Cool. So let's talk about infants and let's talk about the communication in the first few years of life. Um, I guess I start by saying lots of us take communication and language for granted.
Mhm.
And we think, well, it's something that we all just learn and you don't really have to work for it. Of course, if you want to learn a second or third language, especially as you get older, it's really hard, but
Mhm.
you don't really think about how hard you had to work for acquiring your mother's tongue. Can you talk a little bit about what does it look like when, like two different scenarios when someone just by nature they'll learn language, and how often or what are the common scenarios where that just may not happen and somebody
Mhm.
might need assistance and help?
Sure, yeah. No, I think you have a good point. Like, when learning language for young children, for infants, is so complex and there's so much that goes into it. And if you really break down what's happening in the brain and the minds of these infants, it's miraculous what they are able to do and understand and learn. And if that system goes pretty smoothly, you don't really, as an observer, as a parent, recognize how much effort went into that. And so I think that if there is something at play that's impacting how that process and making it more effortful, that's going to impact language learning. And that could be a whole host of different things. Children who are a little bit more active and distracted might have a harder time learning language, or children that aren't as motivated socially or as motivated to communicate might have a hard time, because so much of what goes into language learning is social interaction and that willingness and ability to connect with the important people in your life. And that can be hard for kids for a variety of reasons. So I think when you're looking at sort of what goes into language learning and what that might look like if it goes, awry, there's many different aspects that we would want to look at, which is why you would see a speech pathologist, a professional, to parse out if the impact is caused by maybe the speech, like the motor output, versus the language, like the grammar or the conceptualization, the vocabulary, versus the social interaction or the motivation to communicate, and sort of how all of we talk about them like they're separate aspects of communication, but really you can't separate one from the other. And so there's so many different things that can be at play when language learning is tough for a kid. But in that same respect, there's so much that we can do to support children and to support their parents in getting their language learning on track, or improving them, or helping them in some way.
So we'll come back to what are the things that we can do to support children
Mhm.
that are having a tough time. Let's just come back to the point with, most of us, I think statistically, something around 80 to 90% of us learn language without having to struggle in the first
Mhm.
few years of life.
Mhm.
Um, what's the role of environment or the nurturing aspect of learning language? In other words, if two children that are in the same probably demographic and I guess area and cultural background, but you still see them speaking with different levels of sophistication, their reading skills are different later on in school. How much of that do you think is nature or genetic factors versus the environment that they're raised in?
Yeah, I mean, I think for any parent who has two children and sees radical differences in their temperaments and their personalities and their language levels, knows that there must be some sort of genetic difference, that there is this, and this ongoing debate of this nature versus nurture and which is more impactful. But I think it's hard to really separate your genetics versus your environment, because your genetics and your personality and your temperament dictate how people are going to start to respond and parent and nurture you. So there's this sort of cycle of interaction that happens between your predisposition to language learning, your personality and your biology and your genetic makeup, and the environment in which you're exposed. And so I think that there are important factors that come from each of those sort of categories, but that you couldn't really say that it was one thing that caused a language delay or another thing that
Right.
didn't cause a language delay.
Right. But I guess let's rephrase the question. If a child is so-and-so typical, whatever, however we define that, are there still things that parents could do to change the trajectory of the child's language development or literacy skills? And if there are, what are those?
For sure. I mean, it's that idea of, like, some kids are really good athletes and you nurture that and they become excellent athletes, and some kids are just not interested, not motivated. No matter how much you try to play sports with them, they just don't care that much. So there's definitely a lot that parents can do to modify. So if language learning is hard for your child, there are just more things that you might need to do as a parent to support them in their language learning. Just like if your child is delayed in their walking or delayed in another skill, there's more things that you're going to need to do to help them to reach their goals and to reach their milestones. So 100%, there's so much that parents can do. And at the end of the day, the environment and the interactions that the child has are going to be the most important predictor of their success in language and literacy skills. And we know that exposure to books, having parents who are modeling language, who are talking to their children, that those are big predictors of language development and later literacy success and academic success for those so-called neurotypical kids and kids who are, presenting with a language delay or a different style of learning early on.
Cool. So let's come back to some of the things that you could do to support your child. You mentioned reading books, obviously speaking to your child. What are some of the, I don't know if magic trick is the right word, but what are the strategies that you, because coaching parents is a big part of your practice, especially now that, a lot of the one-on-one sessions have been moved online. I think parents are the ones that are really the facilitators. So what are the things that you suggest to parents, whether they have a concern or not, to be able to do at home, that are simple but are very effective, and it really helps to promote the child?
Sure. I think that children, any of us, learn best when we're motivated and engaged and interested in what we're studying or what we're learning. And the same exact principle goes for children. So the most important thing that parents can do is, I'd say, like, play with your child, have fun with your child, read books with your child, enjoy your time with them. And when they show interest in something, or they look to something, or they point to something, or they're fixating on something, talk about what it is that they're thinking about and that they're paying attention to. Model language that you want them to learn. Talk to your children, and don't always feel like you need to test their knowledge, because nobody likes to be tested all the time. So try to be conscious about how many questions you're asking versus how much language you're teaching and modeling. So I think it's hard to sort of pare it down to one thing, but kids need responsive adult interactions. They need you to be responsive to them, and that your responses are contingent on what they're thinking about. And that's the key element to language learning.
Cool. So you've been doing parent coaching for a while. Tell me, what are the kind of stories or the parenting styles that you have seen? I remember when I first talked to you about, parent coaching, you were like, there's this type of parenting style, and there is, another type. Talk about that, because I think both parents and other practitioners might find it helpful to kind of know, okay, if I'm this or that, what does that mean for my child? And am I really supporting the child's language development?
So I think there's a couple things that you're touching on there, because when we were talking about it in the past, I think when parents come to therapy, there are some different expectations that parents come with. And having worked in a model of parent coaching for a long time, because that's going to be the most effective therapy, sometimes I'll spend more of the therapy program helping parents recognize the power that they have in supporting their child's language learning and being open to the parent coaching, which can be challenging for any number of factors. And then there's some parents who kind of come in, they're like, tell me what I can do. I'm going to start doing it. I'm ready. So there can be so many reasons why parents come into therapy with different expectations. Their cultural beliefs, their background, their experiences with therapy, their experience with other professionals. So I try to kind of take that into account and really suss out from the beginning of therapy what a parent's expectations of the therapy are. So I think that when it comes to parents' expectations about therapy, you see different sort of styles and ways of thinking, but also just parents have different parenting styles. And I think that there's, from what I see and what I know, there's not one style that's necessarily right or better. It's about how well matched your parenting style is with the temperament and personality of your child. So some kids will respond really well to more authoritative, questioning, testing, directing kind of styles, and some kids won't. And some kids need a parent who's sort of super silly and animated and excited all the time to kind of keep them engaged and keep them motivated. But not every parent is like that. That's just people's personalities. So I think sort of that's a big piece that I see of this, of helping parents understand their child's temperament and personality so that we can find a good match there, especially when kids are language delayed or language learning is hard. As a parent, you don't always get the best feedback from them about if what you're doing is helping or working or that they're enjoying it. And so that can sort of set off this spiral of not being as motivated to keep trying or feeling frustrated by your attempts. So yeah, I think that having a therapist can really help you get more perspective on what's working and what's not working, and sort of see what you're already doing that's really successful. You just might not have been so aware of it yet.
You know what's really interesting, and I just realized this, maybe it's because of your background in psychology, but I just realized a big part of what you're doing is not necessarily speech therapy, but being able to coach parents and really understanding the underlying, psychology and their, cultural, contextual motivations to really understand them and the child and be able to give them a framework that's successful as they interact with each other, which I think is very, very different than probably what people think of speech therapists. Was that something that you were always doing, or do you think the post-pandemic world?
No, I think that sort of approach that I take came like in conjunction with my psychology background, but also I work at the George Hall Center, which is a children's mental health center. So we really recognize and understand the impact of language development and children's mental health and the mental health of the whole family. So I think that the George Hall Center has really given me good context, or sort of has matched my approach in that, recognizing that you can't just target something with a child and expect it to work, that it's not a one-size-fits-all model. I believe that most speech therapists understand the individuality of every family, the uniqueness of each family and each client, and know to adapt and modify their approach to fit that.
Yeah, no, that's fair. So let's talk for a second about, if I'm a parent and my child is, young, could be 9 months, could be 18, could be 24. And I have, there's that like parent instinct that I feel like maybe my child is delayed or something isn't right. What is the first thing you suggest them do?
I mean, I would say talk to your pediatrician, or if your child's in daycare, talk to daycare staff, talk to other people around that are professionals and bring it up. But ultimately, really trust your instinct, because no matter how many professionals or experts you speak to, you're the expert on your own child. So I would say talk to people to get, a sense of what you might need to do, or what resources are available to you. But if you're concerned about your child's language development, or you have concerns about their behavior or their play skills, the way they play with toys or with other kids, those are real concerns, and you should bring them up to people already either involved in your child's life, or with a speech language pathologist. And if you, wherever you are, you can Google speech pathologists in your area as a way, just to get a sense of what's out there and who's out there. And then you can kind of start to connect with professionals that way, or through, mommy blogs or parenting Facebook groups. You can get referrals from friends. So I would say the most important thing I would say is to trust your instinct and pursue support and look for resources until you feel like you're getting the support that you need, or you're getting answers to the questions that you have.
So push until you feel like you're at least on the right path, I guess.
I think, the worst thing that could happen is you go see a professional and they tell you that nothing's wrong. But
yeah,
I think that it's always worth pursuing those instincts that you have as a parent, because you know your child better than anyone. You might not know what's expected at every age, or what is typical, but if you sense that something's not going in the way you expected, then for sure I would say pursue that until you feel like you've got your answers, your problems met.
And a lot of it, I think the issue comes down to what is expected, and that the lack of a common definition of normal, I think sometimes is makes it challenging for parents, especially, to know when is the time to really push hard. Like, is this a problem that needs to be addressed now, or can it wait? And sometimes it's obviously, the misrecommendations that parents receive. So I get the point that, trust your instincts, but I guess what are some of the concrete things that you would say in the first, let's say, 12 months, if a parent doesn't see or hear or observe, you would say for sure they need to speak to a professional and not wait until the child is 18 months, the child checkup is coming?
Yeah, I would say, as a number one rule, like, do not wait and see. Many doctors might say, oh, well, just wait, they're young, or, other professionals might say that. But if you talk to any speech pathologist, they're for sure going to tell you, do not wait and see. We'll work with infants. We'll work with young children, because there's so much that parents can do in those early stages to start to support their children. So if you're noticing that your child seems unusually quiet, they're not babbling a lot, they're not making noises, you don't have to necessarily know what specific types of noises they should be making at each stage. But if you find that your baby is always very, very quiet, especially around that 6 month, 7 month, 8 month mark, when they really should be starting to explore their mouth and the sounds they can make, that's definitely, I would say, something that would warrant pursuing further support. If your baby's not really smiling or focusing on you when you look at them, that's something that I would say talk to a professional about that. Babies start to pay attention to the people in their environment at a pretty young age. So if you feel like that isn't happening, or that isn't clear to you, then that's definitely a time, I would say, for young babies as a time to seek support.
Okay, so I'll push you on a little bit on this, like, or not push you, but like, let's double click on the wait and see problem, which is sometimes cultural. We know that, some cultures are less, I guess, prone to seeking advice from a professional at that such a young age. Or some cultures are even known as being more quiet. What are some of the other challenges that you as a professional have in terms of seeing children as early as you wish they would come to you? What are some of the struggles or barriers that you're facing?
I think probably the two biggest barriers are one, getting those referrals in really early. And typically with young, like infants and early toddlers, the pediatrician's the only person, the main professional that has eyes on the child and that is familiar with child development in a way that they could see if something was not developing in the right trajectory. So I'd say earlier identification and more referrals, even if you just are mildly concerned that something isn't going right. So that's a big barrier, I think, to early identification. And also, there's just wait lists for most families who can't afford to pay privately. You're kind of bound by the system, and there are long waits for services. So it's all the more reason that I would say don't wait and see, because if you wait till your 18-month well-being checkup and then you don't get in to see your therapist for 4 or 5, 6 months after, then that's fine. There's still so much we can do. Your child's still very young, but the earlier that we can support families, the better.
So believing that, pediatricians and GPs also want the best for their patients,
For sure.
families that they see them, why do you think is the reason that sometimes families fall through the cracks and don't get referral as early as they could have?
I think there's a lot of factors there, or a lot of pieces to tease apart, but often, and you might be able to speak to this more, your appointments with your pediatrician are quite brief. And the doctor isn't always the most enjoyable place for your child. So it's not like pediatricians are seeing kids at their top performance in their most comfortable environments for those 15-minute, 20-minute appointments they have every once in a while. So I think that it is easy for things to get missed in that way. But I think that they're also, and maybe pediatricians or GPs would not agree with this, I think that there needs to be a bit more of a belief in the power of therapy and that speech pathologists can do so much at such a young age, and more education on the impact of speech pathology and what we can do with infants and toddlers. So I think education would be a big part in trying to get word out to all the new doctors out there.
Yeah, to
Yeah.
me, it's a systematic problem. It's like
Mhm.
education for parents, education on the healthcare, the medical professionals on importance of not just importance of early intervention, but what are the things that you guys can do? Some of the things that, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I've also heard this from doctors. I don't think every doctor is going to agree with this, but I have heard it, and I'd be curious if you ever interview the doctor on the show to get their input, is that doctors know and they're familiar with these long waits that we have, and so they kind of only want to refer kids that they know are going to need the service, that they're more resistant to refer when there's maybe they're going to be okay kind of mentality. So I think that speaks to the systemic issue. If our wait lists are 10 times as long as they are now, I believe that the government will understand that we need to put more resources towards these programs and towards these kinds of services. But if there's doesn't seem like there's as high demand for the service as there actually is, it's hard to lobby for more funding or more support and more resources.
That's really interesting. So it's kind of constantly, it becomes a chicken and egg problem, right?
Yeah.
We don't get enough families referred to the system. We don't, which I still believe the system is overloaded.
Yeah.
But to your point, if there's not enough, referrals, and if we don't collectively believe that truly, these kids could benefit from early intervention as early as like 6 months, 9 months, then there's not enough motivation to lobby for change. Another thing that we've been hearing a lot as well with the work that we are doing is, well, if you tell the parent that their child isn't necessarily meeting that particular milestone by 9 months, and you send them to the doctor, and the doctor refers them, you are overloading the system, but you're also making the parent panicked. And
Mm-hmm.
while that's not at all the goal, but I guess I'm curious to hear your thoughts in terms of would it be still beneficial to tell a parent who might have a perfectly fine child, but if they're still concerned, to refer them to a professional? Because to your point, I guess the worst thing that can happen is,
yeah, I mean, I think there's not like a clear answer, because yes, we don't want to overload this already overloaded system with families who don't need the service. But with so many kids who are what we can call like late talkers, many of them do grow out of it, but more of them don't. And we don't know when they're 2 or 2.5 exactly which ones are going to be fine without intervention and which ones really will benefit from intervention. So we know that early intervention works. So I think that there's more benefit in getting those parents in. I think that the amount of service that's available shouldn't impact the referrals. And I think that if a child is typically developing, but a parent is very concerned about it, then that's going to have an impact on the dynamic between the parent and the child, and the parent's belief in the child's capabilities. And so if 1 appointment or 2 appointments or a consult with a professional could nip that dynamic in the bud and help parents recognize how well their children are developing, I think that there's a lot of value in that as well.
Totally. I've also spoken with parents who've said, I was never aware that there is a private option. That, you know, to your point, some GPs or pediatricians might feel, oh, if this is not a very serious problem, why should I refer them to your point, an overloaded system, and they'll be in the wait list for 6 to 12 months. Whereas there could be, not everyone can afford it, unfortunately, but there could be this other alternative. So if there was someone listening to this and they are either a pediatrician or a GP, what would you like to tell them about the world of speech therapy, and what are some of the things that maybe they can tell their families or they could do in collaboration with speech therapists?
I think I would say to refer more often, and to believe in the power of therapy, and to recognize your role in empowering parents, and the important role that you play with families in terms of providing them the information and access to resources that they could use. And then families can decide what they want to do with it. But I think so many families really turn to their pediatricians as, the be all end all on their child, as they should. The pediatrician should be someone that parents can rely on. And so I think that I would ask pediatricians and family doctors to recognize and be aware of sort of that power and that influence that they have on parents' perspectives.
Awesome. Is there anything that you wanted to add that I should have asked, or you wanted to just, comment on about any of the topics we talked about?
I don't think so. I think that covered it. Yeah.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah.
So at the end, I'll ask you to suggest a few resources,
Okay.
whether it's for your fellow clinicians or parents. What are some of the books or that you would like to introduce that we could include in this show?
For both fellow SLPs and for families. Okay. Will you ask me first, or should I just answer?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I'd say some of the resources that I have found to be so useful, and that I share with families and with other SLPs, or with newer graduating students or newer SLPs. The first resource is teachmethetalk.com. And this is a website of a speech pathologist in Kentucky who does an amazing job of taking all of the research and doing so much research and compiling it together, and then presenting it in the most parent-friendly way possible. And I really believe I learned more from her than I learned in my mentorship roles, because she really tells you sort of the why. Why are we modeling language like this? Why are we playing like this? Why is play important? So she has a website, she has material, she has a blog, she has video, she has a podcast. So I think she is a great, great, great resource for new clinicians or, an older clinician, an experienced clinician who's transitioning to work more in early intervention. She's so full of ideas and materials and resources. So I definitely recommend her. I'm also a big fan of the center on, let me remember what it's called now. Yeah, on the Center on the Developing Child from Harvard University. And they have a lot of resources and videos and activities and things targeted for parents, but also for professionals, talking about the importance of the early years of a child's life and how to set a really strong foundation for children in those first few years of their life. So those are two of my favorite resources, I'd say, that I still go back to when I'm looking for ideas or if I want to link something to a family. So those are two of my favorites. And then in terms of books or resources for kids, toys that I'd recommend for parents, I'd say in terms of toys, there's no good toy or bad toy. It's how you use it. So anything you have in your house right now could be a really useful toy. If your child's interested in it, it could be the fancy toy that you bought at the toy store, and it could be the cardboard box or the pots and pans. And those are all amazing things for kids to play with. It doesn't have to be a fancy object, but if it is going to be an object, I'd recommend something that's not electronic. And in terms of books, my favorite book, and probably the book that I use the most in therapy, is called Dear Zoo by Rod Campbell. It's a really simple story of a child who writes a letter to the zoo asking for a pet, and they keep sending him pets, and there keeps being something about the pet he can't keep. So there's lots of vocabulary because it's talking about all these different describing words, all these different adjectives. There's flaps that children can lift up, so it's very interactive. And I'll use that with really, really young kids and older kind of preschool age or early kindergarten kids for a variety of targets. And again, I'll just say, when it comes to books, you don't have to read all the words. You don't have to stick to the text. You can flip and skip pages and let your child lead that interaction and let them dictate what they're interested in. But exposure to books is important. So read books with your kids, let them play with books, have books around the house. When we can go to libraries again, go to the library with your kids, let them pick out the books that they like. There are no right or wrong things when it comes to books as long as your children are motivated by it.
Cool. I haven't heard about that book. I'm gonna look it up.
It's fun. Yeah.
And maybe we should do a reading session with you where we record you reading that book. Would love to see how you would do it.
Oh, I would do it so differently depending on the child I was doing it with.
Well, let's challenge you to do it for 1,000 children.
Okay. Okay, we'll talk.
Cool. Yeah. It was good talking to you, Talia. This
was great. I had a great time.
Yeah, same. And I can see so many things, following to this conversation, especially about the systematic issue and also some of the things that you brought up in terms of, the parent style and dynamic with the child, that, in the future, I hope to have more follow-up conversations on.
Great. I'd love to. Thanks for having me. Thanks for the interview.
No problem. Okay. Have a good one.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.